Greetings and welcome to the Department of Tangents podcast, a conversation with author Daniel Kraus with new music from Six String Drag. I'm your host, Nick Zano. Daniel Kraus has written a number of novels, including Rotters, a great horror novel I'm currently finishing up. What puts him front and center right now is his work with Guillermo del Toro on the Oscar-winning story For the Shape of Water. Kraus had the story idea years ago that he might want to do something about a love affair blossoming between a creature and an employee of a lab. He was already working with del Toro on the Trollhunters book, which became the series on Netflix. He mentioned the idea to del Toro, and that got the ball rolling. You'll hear more about that in the conversation. That opened up the opportunity for Kraus to work on his own version of the story in novel form. He used the backbone from the script and expanded the backstory and mythology to paint a fuller picture of the characters, most notably the heavy Strickland and his initial relationship with the creature. That was a large chunk of our conversation, but Kraus is currently working on another collaboration of sorts, finishing off a novel that George Romero had been working on that would span the history of his zombie movies. We also got to talk about horror in a more philosophical way, how the concepts of humanity and beauty work within that frame. And a warning, you do get to hear both mine and Kraus's dogs in the background. Apparently they wanted in on the conversation. After the interview, our featured track this week is Let's Fool Around Till the End of the World by Six String Drag from their new album Top of the World. Next week's guest is Kenny Roby of Six String Drag, but more on that later. Now, enjoy Daniel Kraus. Starting out with Shape of Water, this is not a tie-in or a word you must hate, the novelization of the movie, correct?
Yeah, correct. I mean, in some ways it does fit the label of novelization. No, it's not a word I like because it has negative connotations. And in some ways it's not a typical novelization, but in other ways it has elements of it, because although the idea started with me, then it went to Guillermo, who, wrote the screenplay, and then the book then was sort of based on that screenplay, and then plus other stuff that I had been planning all along that I wanted to put in. So there is an element of it there. Mm-hmm.
How was that back and forth? You had an original idea that you talked to del Toro about. And then he wrote the screenplay and gave that back to you, and then you used that as the backbone of the novel. Is that how it worked out?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. And how did the idea come up there? I believe you told the story that it came up during tennis, and he has mentioned that it came up during breakfast.
Yeah, those are two different things.
Okay.
My memory, which is completely unreliable, in specifics, is when I was a kid, for some reason I have a memory of being by the tennis courts by my middle school in my Iowa town that I grew up, and thinking about this idea. And so I've kind of gone with that legend. It's hard to say whether or not, it's hard to remember things that happened when you were a kid. But for some reason it sticks in my head that I was daydreaming when I should have been, paying attention in gym class or something, and came up with the general concept of it, And then that concept sort of stuck around in my head for many, many years as I became, after I became a novelist and stuff. Mm-hmm. And then it was at breakfast with Guillermo when we were talking about Trollhunters. When I mentioned it, it just kind of came up conversationally. Mm-hmm. And then I mentioned to him this idea that I'd had since I was a kid, and that's when he sort of embraced it, and we started talking about it.
Mm-hmm. What was your original idea before this started? What was the idea you had when you were 15?
It was very simple, and I could have been younger than that. I could have been 12. I mean, I'm not really sure. But I was certainly young, and the idea was very simple. It was an idea, no doubt, based on my interest in creatures from the Black Lagoon. Mm-hmm. And I I was a big fan of horror movies as a little kid, and certainly I had seen all the Universal horror movies, and my favorite one was Black Lagoon by far. And I had little black creatures on Black Lagoon toy, even sort of an action figure.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so my guess is that I'd watched the movie again, and it's hard to watch that movie and not, if you have a heart at all, and not feel bad for the creature who does.
Right.
It does very little wrong in the movie. Just these guys, white guys in a boat, come down to the Amazon and basically harass him and harpoon him. And
right.
By the end, you feel pretty bad, or at least I did, for the creature. And I know, down in Mexico, Guillermo was having the same feelings, really. We wouldn't meet for decades, but he was having the same thoughts. So my concept was just sort of picking up at the end of that movie and giving the creature a better ending, which was after they've harpooned the creature, they naturally take him back to a lab. That only makes logical sense, and is in fact how the sequel to Creature from Black Lagoon, called Revenge of the Creature, that's exactly how that movie begins. They take the creature back to the lab. So my idea that I had for decades when I presented to Guillermo was this, that the creature was in a tank in the lab, and a night janitor discovers it and establishes a relationship with it, and then decides to break it out and take it home and put it in her tub. And that was it. That's as far as it went. And when I told Guillermo the idea, that's as far as it was. It was that simple.
And then he bought the idea to use for the movie. Is that the way that works?
Yep. He optioned the idea that same day that I told him about it.
The movie that he made is an obvious love letter to the Universal horror movies, with obviously some significant social and political updates. Do you see the book in the same way, as sort of a love letter to this material, to this creature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if Guillermo hadn't come along, my intent was always to write the book one day, regardless. But, many years had gone by, and I still hadn't really cracked it. Like, it still is just a notion, just an idea. So who knows when or if I would have gotten to it, But it was always on my list of projects to get to. But yeah, it was always completely an homage to those movies. And something I do a lot in my books is I sort of take iconography from horror and use it in a different way. So this idea of using the creature from Black Lagoon in a story that wasn't really a horror story fits right into the kind of stuff that I was doing.
The reductive storyline on it, the people who haven't maybe seen it yet say, "Oh, is it that movie about the woman who has sex with the fish?" I'm assuming you've heard some version of that.
Oh yeah.
What is your counter to that?
Well, I mean, as silly as that is, and as sort of reductive as that is, there's something about it that it's not. I mean, it's not wrong either.
Right.
It's what's so beautiful about the initial idea that I had, and it became obviously more beautiful when Guillermo got his hands on it, is that it's a really sort of open-hearted, wide open-armed movie that is ultimately ended up being about love and there are no fish people out there, so we don't really have to worry about people having sex with fish. But what do exist are lots of different kinds of people on a whole spectrum of, gender identities and how people think of themselves and present themselves. And I think this movie in the book really sort of captured that in a kind of special way that connected with a lot of people. Maybe even a lot of people who wouldn't have thought that those topics were something they were interested in. But now can sort of look at that movie as an extreme example of, two beings who are not your general, just two straight white people having a romance. They're vastly different than each other in think it became an important product in that way, and I think it's to say it's the movie with fish sex. It does. There's something important about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, then that's the 1A story is the romance between these sort of two outcasts, but I think the 1B story is about prejudice. Would you agree with that? I mean, because it's you get to so many different outliers in society in 1962. There are you deal with race, you deal with Giles' identity as a gay man, and that relation to the mainstream white male world.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's baked in to Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, of course, we didn't have to have any fealty to that if we didn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that is there. So if you want to treat that as some sort of source text in some sort of spiritual way,
mm-hmm.
a lot of it's right there in the movie, the original movie. There's my initial idea had really nothing. So there's nothing in my original pitch that had anything about the Cold War really in it. But if you watch the original movie, it's all right there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene near the beginning of the movie where they're literally talking about using the creature for sort of military application.
Mm-hmm.
And in my first meeting with Guillermo, he locked in on that immediately. He was already talking about that, which is slightly embarrassing to me because it had never occurred to me as much as I'm a fan of that, and as long as I carried around this idea. And again, so you can sort of extend from this movie the general time period of the Creature from Black Lagoon. You find yourself sort of plopped down in this time period, and if you're going to stick with that time period, there's something rich there. We could have
mm-hmm.
set this in modern day. We could have done a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you keep it in that time period, it serves up a lot of things that you can talk about. And a lot of what jumps out at you as a modern person looking back at the early 60s are these sort of situations where people who were outcasts had to find different ways to get what they wanted. And at the same time, the people who were supposedly, in the middle of, like right dead down the middle of American society, like Strickland and his wife,
mm-hmm.
were being told what they wanted, in advertisements and catalogs and everything else, being told what they were supposed to want and supposed to make them happy, and it wasn't. So it's a very prescriptive sense. There's a very prescriptive way for the sort of middle and upper classes, and then everyone else was sort of left behind, and then really nobody was happy.
Mm-hmm. You've expanded on the characters quite a lot. Is that a natural extension of this idea?
Yeah, definitely.
I'd like to go through some of the characters a little bit. I think there's more about Eliza. You get to hear her inner voice a bit. You get to hear a lot more background about Strickland, about how he finds the creature. You get a bit more about the creature from its own point of view, and I think the biggest increase in visibility in the story is Lainey, Strickland's wife.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's kind of a prop for Strickland in the movie, but she gets her own identity here.
Right.
How did you decide where to expand the backstories? What you wanted each character to be in the book as opposed to who they are in the movie?
In most ways, it was very instinctive and natural. The short answer is you just expand everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You are writing a book which has, it's the equivalent of writing a few seasons of a series rather than a 2-hour movie.
Mm-hmm.
So you have just naturally way more time to spend digging into these characters. So the easy answer is you just expand everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there were characters obviously who get expanded more. Lainey is example, since she doesn't really have much of a character in the movie. But when approaching the book, I did want more of somebody to represent sort of the center of society, the person who supposedly had it all, the person who had the one or two cars and the two kids and the nice house and the husband who was going places. I think in the movie you can kind of get away with not having that because you have this sort of mise-en-scène that you can look at and listen to and feel. In the book, I think it helps to flesh that out with a character. And then you can kind of see the outsiders of the movie, kind of what they're bouncing off of, like what they don't have. And then when you compare to Lainey, you can see that she has all these things, and she's just as unhappy as they are, if not more. I liked how she could sort of represent the early 60s ideal. And by doing that, particularly because she's a woman, you can kind of see how that was particularly restrictive and nowhere near to being fulfilling for her.
Well, you have her breaking from that early 60s ideal in a lot of ways. There's the scene where she has the thought that maybe I don't have to watch I Love Lucy every morning. Maybe I can watch the news. Maybe I can have thoughts on what's going on in these places around the world.
Yeah.
And that's
exactly right.
It feels like the book the social and political themes emerge a lot more clearly.
Yeah, and again, it's a difference of mediums. You're able to shorthand things in film, and I think Guillermo did just a fantastic job of it. I think those shorthands that you're able to do with music and sound and color and all those things, cinematography, art direction, you don't have those in a book. And I can't go into it assuming anyone who's read this book has ever seen the movie. At this point, there's probably a lot of people who have, but I can't go into the book assuming that. So you really have to start from square one and build something that stands completely on its own.
Right, and you didn't have Michael Shannon, who was wonderful in the film. It's that offbeat menace that he has, that absolute laser focus.
Right, and that character was probably, next to Lainey, the character who gets the most development in the book. And that was something I really did want to do from the beginning. Was I wanted the book to have almost two main characters. So it'd be Eliza and Strickland. And right from the opening section, cuts back between those two. So it really establishes early on that this is going to be sort of a dichotomy look at this plot from these two different characters' point of view, both of whom want something from the character or from the creature, both of whom the creature represents something different. And so I think the character of Strickland, although again I think Guillermo did a great job of hinting at the sort of pain and stress he's under, I can go into that a lot deeper in the book and really explain, why he was sent down to get the creature, what it meant to him, what it meant to his career, what it meant to him repairing his family. I think it was, for me, the most pleasurable parts of the book were to write Strickland and humanize him a little.
Did it help or hurt to have actual physical representations of these characters already out there in the world as you were writing, or did you not pay attention to any of that?
That's a great question. I think when I started writing on the book, I kept away from all things having to do with the movie, but I was aware he was cast in it. So I did know that Michael Shannon was playing Strickland. I did know Richard Jenkins was playing Giles. So I knew all these things. And there was no way to, it felt false to me to, it just felt like it wasn't. It was to veer away from those representations that I knew existed, and that meant something to Guillermo too. You know, like he cast these people for a reason. It felt needlessly brash to like change their physical reputations a lot. I didn't see any point to it. Like it seemed like it'd just be show-offy if we were going to say, okay, in this book, you know, Strickland was completely different. He looks completely different in accident. But it just felt like, you know, I wanted the book to be a book because it was really good, you know, not because it represented some alternate version of events and characters that was wildly different. You know, some sort of, you know, alt-universe kind of situation. You know, I think that's kind of easy and cheap. Could have done it. We could have got interesting, you know, notice for veering in unexpected ways. But I don't think you're really just trying to write a really good piece of literature. You know, you want to do the best what you can without resorting to that, if possible.
I mean, did you have the actors in your head as the characters, or did you have a completely different idea of what the characters might look like?
No, I mean, yeah, I did have them in my head. Now, some of them I wasn't overly familiar with. You know, like I know, you know, I certainly knew who Michael Shannon was, but a lot of the other actors I sort of knew only kind of in passing, and I wasn't real familiar with their work. So it was largely images of their faces that I knew. And that's not a whole lot. It's easy to sort of just have a picture of a face in your mind, and you can kind of still go whatever direction you want. So it didn't really overwhelm the writing at all. I think if I had gone to set and watched them act or seen any scenes like that, I might have seen a different tune.
Do you keep people in mind when you're writing a character? Do you have a physical appearance of, you know, somebody you know or an actor or something in mind? Does that help you crystallize things when you're writing your own work?
Yeah, not always. Sometimes it's specific like that. Other times it's a little vaguer. You sort of have a shape of them. Maybe you don't know exactly what their face looks like, but there are elements of it, and it comes out in the writing too. You know, you may start writing a character and have no idea what they look like, but then in one scene suddenly you'll be describing part of what they look like for some, you know, plot-related reason. And so they come into focus. Now, there have been occasional characters that I've written in other books that, for some reason, their physical appearance was really important. Like I wrote in my book, Zebulon Finch, there was a Hollywood actress. And so I really kind of wanted to get down in my head exactly what she looked like, because her physicality was very important in what she looked like and how beautiful she was. And also what kind of dresses she wore was very important. So I looked in a lot of, you know, Hollywood books to figure out which actress she sort of looked like and what kind of clothing she wore. And so every character is sort of different. They require different things from you.
It seems like when I'm reading fiction, especially if it's a longer novel, my idea of what the characters look like and what the environment looks like shifts, sometimes subtly, sometimes less subtly, as the story goes on. Sometimes as a function of what the novel reveals about those characters.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then sometimes it surprises you.
Yeah.
I think if a book goes a long time without describing something about the character physically, you know, it's like hearing a voice on the radio. You have your own ideas, and then suddenly on page 300, they say, this character has blonde hair, and you're like, whoa, that's not what I was thinking at all.
Right. Del Toro has a specific visual style. Is that something you kept in mind at all, or is it something you had to sort of... Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, not really at all. Now, there were things that were sort of stylistically evident from the screenplay, but that's still a pretty far cry from general, no.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, I know who I'm working with. I know who Guillermo is. You know, we've worked together before. I have a sense of, you know, I do have a sense of what he writes like and his sensibilities. But there's no way to really proceed without my sensibilities,
Mm-hmm.
you know, having a huge part in it. So, no, I didn't really think too much of Guillermo as a filmmaker as much as I did just Guillermo as a writer.
Mm-hmm. And you also, another choice I wanted to mention here that you made is you actually give the creature a voice at times,
Mm-hmm.
which seems like a fairly tough nut to crack. How did you approach doing that?
Yeah, that was something that I was excited and nervous about doing. I think if you do that, there's got to be a reason to do it. Because I've easily just not done it.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I did have this idea about what the creature was and wasn't, and how the creature related to, I don't want to give any spoilers, but how the creature related to other beings and other creatures. And I thought a really interesting way to incorporate that would be to briefly go inside the creature's head, and just by the way the sort of words are presented from his point of view, you know what I'm talking about. It sort of immediately becomes evident that, okay, the way, I'm trying to say it without saying it, but the perspective I choose to tell his sections from, I think immediately changes sort of how you assess what he is.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly by the very last scene in the book, which is from his point of view, something sort of radical happens with the point of view. You kind of either, it adds something, I think, which was the whole point. If it wasn't going to add something to the idea of the creature, then I wouldn't have tried it.
It's jarring at first when it first happens in print, because it's a sort of stream of conscious kind of just flow of words.
Right.
You're wondering, well, what the hell is this? Whose perspective am I in? And it takes you a couple of sentences, I think, in to really figure out, oh, well, wait, I'm in the creature's mind now.
Right, and I like that phrase you just used. I kind of like the idea of it being a flow of words. You know, there's so much symbolism and stuff with water in the movie and the book that I like the idea of the creature's perspective being sort of floating too. Like it's not sort of bound by any sort of human punctuation or even like capital letters. Like it really sort of moves on its own waves.
That plays into Strickland's story as well, because Strickland's whole hang-up is imposing not only an order, but his order on all of nature, basically. Everything around him, whether it's his wife or the creature. There's the moment where he's looking at out in the Amazon, he's looking out over the water, and the captain of the ship has just told him the story about the river dolphin, and he aims his gun out waiting for the thing to show, because he's the one who will bring the nightmares, not some creature from outside.
Right. Yeah, I think he's a character that's a really good way to put it, that he feels like he's been tasked with maintaining control wherever he goes, and when he's in the Amazon, it's about the hardest place to have any kind of control whatsoever. You know, it's just seething with strange life, and that's why it changes him so radically when he's down there, because you really can't control it. And what ends up happening to him in the Amazon is he sort of, you know, fails in controlling it and sort of gives himself over to some sort of animalistic parts of the Amazon, which he does in order to capture the creature. And then for the rest of the book, he's trying to, in some ways, get that animal part out of him, you know, because that animal part equates him with the creature.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to be like the creature. He wants to be clean. He wants to be professional. He wants to be American, not this monster that the jungle had turned him into. He can't be that way and be a good father and husband.
There are moments there that almost humanize him, but then it sort of, in my mind anyways, it snaps back the other direction, because he has these moments where, say, when he's slaughtering monkeys for fun, kind of, and he takes a look at them and sees, these look like my kids, in some way. Their expressions remind me, they're human, they remind me of, but he continues to choose the violence, as he does time after time in the story. He acknowledges this thing and then chooses the violence and chooses the darker choice.
Right, and I think what the book does, I think you're right on. I think the book shows you kind of his struggles to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of because of his history in the military and with General Hoyt, he tends to make more violent decisions. But at least you get to see his struggles with it, and the monkeys are the perfect example. That he was so disturbed by the monkeys and how when they were slaughtering the monkeys, they looked like children. And then, the monkeys haunt him throughout the book. So he is haunted by these things. He doesn't get away scot-free.
But it makes him even more of a monster in a way, because you present places where he could have made different choices.
Yeah.
But he always chooses the violence.
Right, yeah, that's true.
So I did find myself in certain areas wishing some of this stuff had been in the movie, just because I'd want to see what Del Toro would have done with some of these images, especially in the Amazon in the beginning.
Yeah, it is a good thought experiment to imagine what Guillermo would have done. But that's a slippery slope. Once you start talking about all the stuff in the book that you'd like to see filmed, well, then you're talking about a very, very long movie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this would have been a 3 or 4 hour movie, at least, if you added all these in. Now, we talked about a couple of beautiful moments early on, and that's something I wanted to explore a little bit more. There's a lot of beauty in the film and in the book, and they're also, I'm reading Rotters now, and there's a beautiful scene in the beginning of that where Joey, the main character, his mother has just been killed hit by a bus, and he's at his best friend's house that first night, and he and his best friend get their trumpets out in the middle of the night and start playing, and not really caring what the neighborhood might think or what the family might think or who they might wake up. It's a beautiful moment. I'm wondering if you think that horror needs these kinds of beautiful moments, either for balance or for contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is some place where Guillermo and I completely independently came to the same conclusions throughout her life. I am a fan of horror of all types, from the beautiful to the ugly. What I tend to write, though, is I do tend to try to squeeze beauty out of awful things. If there's only one or two threads through all my books, that's got to be one of them, is that I present these terrible, terrible situations and drawn to trying to find beauty in them. Because I think that's sort of what people do. I mean, some people are born rich, some people are born poor, in all manners of circumstances, but, you have these moments of happiness, and you find beauty wherever you are, as long as you're open to it. So it's also just a matter of personal style and like prose style. I've always, and a lot of it started with Rotters. Like when I was dealing with Rotters, which is a book about grave robbing, it started with me sort of really getting into the weeds with what corpses looked like, and all these sort of gnarly details. But because of these grave robbing characters who treated it very much as a respectable art, that was passed down from master to apprentice, I sort of had to force myself to see these horrible things. I mean, there's not much worse in the world than grave robbing. But to try to find beauty in it, in the dirt and the muck, and even like in corpses and in spoil and in rot. And it's I'm not telling you anything new to
right.
say that when you see footage of things that are decomposing, there's often these incredibly vivid colors and things that we might consider beautiful if we didn't know what they were coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of shifting your perspective a little bit, and in sort of looking at things anew. Like to use a really stupid example, a splash of blood on the ground would typically be something that would be very scary. But if we didn't know, if we weren't programmed as animals to be alarmed by that, it might be quite beautiful. This beautiful, rich color that's sort of scattered in a way that's very much like flower, petals or something. So I think that for me, there's a really close tie to horrifying imagery and beautiful imagery. And at the end of the day, I can't really say why I'm so drawn to making those connections, but I think for whatever the reason, they're powerful to me, and I can't stop doing it. It's just something I'm sort of obsessed with. So people kind of make of it what they will. I'm not sure to make it of it myself, really.
Well, there's a theme that could pop up in it of destruction and renewal. Those are two things that go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's a really good point, too. Yeah. I think destruction, renewal, life coming from death, these are all very, simple, obvious concepts, but that doesn't mean that they get talked about a lot in literature or depicted in a visceral way in literature.
But something I think the movie Annihilation did well. There are other things I don't think it did quite well, but that's one thing. Did you see that movie?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, they showed you some incredibly terrifying things, and there are visions of death in there. And when something dies, it transforms, and they're often into something that's covered with flowers, that's sort of a surreal, brightly colored thing, not necessarily what we would immediately jump to and associate with death and horror.
Right. And there's, all across the world, people deal with death and funerals and all that stuff in different ways, and some of them are very sort of morose and dark, and other places deal with it in ways that are beautiful, joyous. And I think it's, when death is the single thing that fuels the human experience and art and all that stuff more than anything else, quite obviously, it demands to be reconsidered constantly. It's as soon as we're aware of children that death exists, I think it affects that knowledge affects every day of your life. So I think it's some people maybe like me are more obsessed with it, but I think it's not unhealthy to continue to process it and continue to think about it in all sorts of different ways, ways that are awful and ways that are beautiful. And I think it's a very human, very normal thing to be wrestling with.
Do you consider yourself a horror author? I know some people have problems with genre tags.
Well, I'll put it this way. I'd be happy to consider myself that. I think half of my books aren't horror, so I would hesitate to say that I only write horror. But by no means would I run from that label. I think horror is a broad umbrella. Yes, horror is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it's also Eyes Without a Face, and all sorts of absolutely poetic, beautiful works. So, although I call myself more, depending on what book I'm writing, I sort of flip through genres, including just sort of straight literary fiction. But it makes me happy when I'm called a horror director, though, or a horror writer, even though that's inaccurate, sort of. I like how it sounds because I have such an affection for the genre. And, I think you could make an argument that all books, all novels are horror novels in some way because they all, even a romance novel at their base are about finding love, and why is that important? Because we're going to die, and you have a certain amount of time left.
Right.
So I think horror is, and romance may be the second, but horror may be the primary genre that underlies everything. Mm-hmm. And then I would say romance may be the second.
Is that what drew you to writing first?
Yeah, I mean, from a young age, as I said, a very young age, maybe like 5 or 6 years old, I was watching horror stuff, and I was always interested in it. Certainly I didn't have highfalutin ideas about it, but
mm-hmm.
But obviously, yeah, there was something. I may have my theories on it, but there was something that drew me to horror right away.
Mm. Now, I wanted to also ask about the Living Dead, the book you're working on now. Is it finished now, or is it? Are you still working?
I'm still working on it.
And this was initially a collaboration with George Romero?
Yeah, what it was George worked on this novel sort of off and on, the best I can figure, for about 10 years, sort of between other projects, and then died before he could finish it. Mm-hmm. And George was my absolute hero. There was no artist in any art form who I loved more and who affected me more. So it's surreal to me that I was given the opportunity then to complete his book. Mm-hmm. So he got a certain distance into it, and then part of my job was to figure out, based on the clues that he left behind, and then also just what I know about George, which is a lot, and I've learned a lot since, where I think he was going with it. That I can only take that so far. Ultimately, again, just like my collaborations with Guillermo, there's no way for there to not be a lot of me in this too. Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to be as loyal to George and what he was interested in and fascinated by and concerned with as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. How did you get involved with it? Did you know him before he died, or was this initiated after?
No, I had met him once. Mm-hmm. But no, I didn't. I wouldn't say that I knew him. His manager, and Chris Rowe, was aware of me 10 or so years ago when I met George. I met Chris as well, and I gave him some books that I had written. I think I had written Rotters and Scowler, and I think maybe I had gotten the gig with Guillermo on Trollhunters, but hadn't started working on it yet. I'm not really sure. But I think Chris just sort of kept tabs on me over the years as I wrote more books and bigger books, and knew, of course, of my just reverence for George's work. And so when George passed and they were kind of going through some of his properties, Chris and George's widow, Suzanne, talked about what to do with this book. That seemed, I think they made a correct judgment in that it seemed significant. Like it seemed to be a major work in the sort of zombie world that he had created. And to my just continual amazement, they thought of me. It couldn't have hurt that I was coming off of 2 other collaborations, both with Guillermo. So I was somebody who not only understood horror and not only admired George to no end, but I had done a couple collaborations, so I sort of understood how to meld 2 voices together in a halfway convincing way. Mm-hmm. So they got in touch with me, and I still can't really believe it. Mm-hmm.
Is it a lot of pressure to be working on something like this, knowing it's part of this huge legacy?
Yes, it is. When it comes out and there are any problems with it, I will definitely get all the blame. There's no question about that. Because George meant so much to me. The first movie I ever remember watching was Night of the Living Dead, when I was just 5 or 6 years old. Mm-hmm. So the self-pressure is more significant than the sort of external pressure from just horror fans. and stuff. But it's sort of balanced by the fact that it is the only job that I've ever truly been qualified for. All the other jobs I've faked my way through, but I really, truly think that I'm the right guy for it. I think who you want writing a book like this is, what you don't want is somebody who's just a zombie fan. Like that would be the complete wrong tack to take. And, George did a lot of other things that weren't zombie related, and George had his own frustrations with zombies. And, he had his great interest in them, but he was also sort of tied to them in a way that was frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I am the right guy at the right time, at the right place. And I can say this much, there's nobody out there who would take it as seriously as I'm taking it.
Mm-hmm.
As the kind of deep dive that I'm doing into George's history and inclinations and the art that he loved. I've been sort of dousing myself in just all the stuff that he was inspired by,
mm-hmm.
in hopes that it will sort of inspire me. So I'm taking it as seriously as one could possibly take a zombie book, and then some. And so I think at the very least, I'm giving it everything that I've got.
Where does it fall in the in Romero's universe? What can you say about that?
Right. It kind of falls everywhere. It's sort of like his last couple films started, particularly Diary of the Dead. They sort of rebooted the zombie plague,
mm-hmm.
Starting from zero again. And so the book does the same thing. It starts the book sort of is in 3 acts, and the first act begins, on the day the zombie plague begins.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second act, which is a shorter act, sort of, in what I think is a pretty interesting way, sort of zooms through all the time that would have been taken for all the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third act is the furthest along of anything.
Mm-hmm.
So beyond Day of the Dead, beyond Land of the Dead, it's sort of kind of the last word of the zombies.
To get into the survival of the dead sort of territory where attitudes are changing.
Beyond all that, Survival of the Dead, actually in the timeline of the Dead movies is really much more convoluted than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
Survival of the Dead actually only takes place a few weeks after the zombie plague begins.
Oh.
Yeah, it's weird. One of the first things I did was carefully watch the movies and put them in chronological order, which is entirely different than the order in which they were released.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to know where George was heading with the zombie movies, you have to look at Day of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
To sort of get, because that's the one that stretched the farthest down the timeline of the zombies since the plague. And then you have to also look at Survival of the Dead, just because that's the last movie he made and represents his last sort of point of view on the thing as a whole. So you have to kind of marry those two in a way, and kind of extrapolate from there.
Well, it occurs to me, as we're talking about this, there is a strange kind of parallel between Survival of the Dead and Shape of Water, in that the monsters are starting to be humanized in a little bit more in Survival of the Dead. The zombies are seen as something other than just monsters, whereas the humans are the monsters once again.
I think that's a really brilliant observation that no one has mentioned before, and I don't know that I've thought about it in that clear of a sense, but you're totally right. I think growing up on Romero's movies, unless you're just sort of taking from them the surface thrills of the gore and stuff, like that's what I responded to, was this idea that the zombies weren't the bad guys. They're not the bad guys in any of his movies. This is one of the other zombie enemies get it all wrong. The zombies are never the bad guys.
Right.
And I think when you get to, especially like you said, Survival of the Dead, it becomes painfully clear. Although it's clear in the other movies, but painfully clear that the zombies are not the problem here. You're exactly right. The monsters are not the monsters, and in Shape of Water is the same thing. The monster is clearly not the monster. So I think, and when I'm writing all the books that I've written that are horror related, maybe there are monstrous characters in it, but the same thing with Strickland in the Shape of Water book. I'm sort of always fighting that battle with the so-called monsters to see if they're really as monstrous as we think they are, if they're the monsters at all. I think it's a gray area that's, for me, extremely pleasurable to play with. A hallmark of my so-called career is playing with that idea. I think, and you'll get to it as you read Pour in Waters, that there's, a sort of monstrous character in that I take pains to personalize. In some ways, it's the monsters who I care about most, and I think that aligns Guillermo and I strongly. We, for some reason, neither of us can help it. We are attracted to the monster and finding the good in a monster. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can only find a bit of good, and it's not enough. But I think it's always more interesting to try and fail than to just have, just your basic bad guy. I have no interest in that. I think people, especially people who work in certain genres, that sort of simplicity maybe is functional in some genres and is just death in others. I think maybe in some kinds of westerns it works to have the guy with the black hat and the guy with the white hat. But in horror, I think it's a mess.
When is the Living Dead coming out?
That is scheduled to come out fall of 2019.
And what else do you have that you're working on? Is there more Zebulon Finch coming?
Called Bent Heavens. That's coming out. I'm not really sure if it's 2019 or 2020. We're trying to figure that out right now. It's sometimes complicated because you have to sort of make sure one book doesn't come out too close to another book, and so forth. So I got Bent Heavens. That's sort of a dark book that has something to do with aliens.
Do you have it finished yet, or are you still finishing it off?
It's finished, but I'm still revising it and stuff. What else do I have? I have a project coming up after that will come out. Yeah, after that. So now we're talking, 3 years away or so. That I can't talk about yet. And then I am doing a little bit of TV stuff that I can't talk about. Also doing some comic book stuff. These are all things that are not announced yet, so I have to be kind of vague about them. But yeah, I have a bunch of stuff coming up.
Well, keep in touch about that, and I'll announce it on the Department of Tangents blog as it comes out. Yeah, it should be over the next several months. Some of this stuff should be filtering out. But mostly the lion's share of the rest of this year is going to be focused on The Living Dead, which is it's a really long book. It's just a big book. So although it's a total joy to work on, there's just a lot of pages involved. So it's gonna take a little while. And where's the best? What's the best place for people to go and keep tabs on what you're doing?
That's a good question. I do have a website that's just danielkraus.com. I am on Twitter, but I often disappear for many months at a time, so I can focus on other things. So that's Daniel D. Kraus, my handle on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. That's Kraus_author. But although big news we posted there, usually just weird photos I take, and then some shots of my dogs.
All right, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me for this interview.
Yeah, of course. It was fun.
Mm-hmm.
You asked great questions.
Thank you.
An arrow to the head isn't always a trick.
Thanks again to Daniel Kraus. The new book is The Shape of Water. It's out now. You can find it on Amazon and Powell Books and wherever you buy your books. Find out more about Kraus on www.danielkraus.com. And if you liked this episode, please consider subscribing to the Department of Tangents podcast on iTunes and or reviewing it to help get the word out. And you can visit the site at www.departmentoftangents.com. This has been a great year for Six String Drag fans. Not only did the band release a remastered 20th anniversary version of their classic rock and roll Americana album Hi-Hat, they put out an all-new album called Top of the World. Hi-Hat has been a favorite of mine for years. I return to it every few months, and I Can't Remember is currently my ringtone. I encourage you to take a listen to that album. But our featured track this week is Let's Fool Around Till the End of the World from the new album. Kenny Roby will be my guest on the podcast next week. He's a great songwriter, the leader of Six String Drag, and you'll hear his songwriting here. So to get ready for next week's episode, here's Six String Drag's Let's Fool Around Till the End of the World.
Baby, let's get right on the 545. Hit the city by 7. How about 7 to the 5? It's only one weekend and your mama won't know. She ain't said nothing since your brother. Oh, tell me why we never tried it this way before. Leave your oldest inhibitions on the living room floor. You would think that's a lonesome way to become you. Make no plans and it take nothing from you. It's your heart, you should drive it. It's your life if you survive it. Let's fool around till the end of the world. We can handle any scandal that goes down in this town. Pick my jack up from Dina and we'll meet at the Crown. Tell Walter that you got to go see your sister. Is she covered and he won't even call up. Tell me about the battle and went down in the church. Some heavy duty makeup in a Patriots bus. My sister got trapped out back by the woodshed. Turned to ash in the crap on her forehead. It's your heart, you should drive it. It's your life if you survive it. Let's fool around till the end of the And if buying pretty dresses is the best they can do, your family's more a mess than the one you wed to. Well, you're probably jailed like you done something wrong. I pay your bill with some guilt you go along. Never getting lost in your old neighborhood. Stole that roach from your brother, and then I fell in the woods. And I saw him at the station, and I bet he still hates me. Love to get you loaded, let you try to save me. It's your heart, you should drive it. It's your life if you survive it. Let's fool around till the end of the world. Oh, it's your heart, you should drive it. It's your
Neil Young.